Hi Pre-AP students, we are going to start our American Revolution reteach now. Please pay attention to the times you can come to retest. This would be Monday the 28th with Mrs. Lopez after school, Tuesday the 29th with me, Mrs. Countryman before school, or Wednesday the 30th before or after school with Mr. Bender. If any of these times don't work for you, you are allowed to come during third lunch to my room to take the test, but that will only be available on Monday, so please take note of that. Okay, so one of the first things we noticed that you guys struggled with was kind of basically being able to identify what the causes of the American Revolution were. So I just took this slide from some of the notes that some of the classes looked at. So let's start on the left, and basically we start with this king over here, and he's angry. His piggy bank is empty, even though he's just won a war. And so you remember that that's King George, and he's super broke because of the French and Indian War. So he puts in place the proclamation line, and he decides that he needs to collect taxes in order to collect or recapture the money that he has lost from the French and Indian War. So some examples of the taxes that he passed would be the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and so on. And so you know that for the most part, these are just taxes on the basic goods that the colonists are using every day, and that these angered the colonists because, not because they're getting taxed, but because the king is not allowing them to be represented in Parliament, and so they are being taxed without representation. Some important things to note on here: the Stamp Act is the direct cause of the Sons of Liberty, so don't forget that the Stamp Act is right after that is when the Sons of Liberty basically are formed, and they tell people to boycott British goods and so forth. Don't forget that the Intolerable Acts are actually the punishment piece for events such as the Boston Tea Party, which we'll get to in just a moment. And when the king puts these economic policies on the colonists, they react in certain ways. So I'm now looking at the far right-hand column. So they protest, particularly the Sons and Daughters of Liberty protest. They form the battle cry, no taxation without representation. They begin to smuggle goods so that they don't have to pay the taxes. They boycott some British goods like tea, which, remember, that just means to completely refuse to purchase the item to hurt the economy of the other country. And then they also take Benjamin Franklin's advice from the join or die propaganda, and they start joining together. And instead of trying to act like 13 separate governments, they try to come together and start beginning to think about what actions they can take with representatives from all the colonies, and this would happen in the Continental Congress. So let's talk a little bit more about the Tea Act real quick. Remember that once the Tea Act was enforced upon the colonists, they began boycotts of the tea. Eventually, this led to several ships in the Boston Harbor, basically just sitting there full of tea. And so one night, the Sons of Liberty decide to dress up as Native Americans, which we see here on the far right-hand side. So those are the Sons of Liberty. And they board the ships and dump the tea into Boston Harbor. This is just done as a disguise, of course, because they know they can get in a lot of trouble. The tea is dumped into the harbor, and it's millions and millions of dollars in today's money worth of tea. And so the king automatically places a punishment on the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. And you'll remember that this is really targeted at Boston, but it affects all of the colonies. Boston has to close their harbor. No goods in, no goods out. The king bans all town meetings, which is a form of taking away their self-government. And he strengthens the Quartering Act, so more and more troops are being put in place in the colonists' homes. So as a result of all these economic policies, which we see there on the far left of this diagram, the colonists decide finally that enough is enough. We'd like to go ahead and try to claim our independence from England, and so starts the American Revolution. Guys, there's really not a ton that you have to remember about the American Revolution. You don't have to remember every battle. There's just 3 battles that you actually have to know. So you have to know the first battle, and of course that's Lexington and Concord. So number 1. You have to know the last battle, way over here. That's Yorktown. And you have to know the turning point. Those are the only 3 battles that you need to know. So let's talk about how we can remember them. So Lexington and Concord, very, very first battle. There's a very famous poem written much later about this battle called, oh shoot, now I can't even think of what it's called, but it's the author's Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the famous line that you all know from this poem is, "Fired the shot heard round the world." And this shot, this beginning of the American Revolution, is not obviously heard around the world, but the entire world is watching. All eyes are on the colonists. Can a bunch of farmers, can the underdog beat the strongest army in the world? So time goes on. The colonists, of course, meet at the Continental Congress and have Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we know that's the biggest breakup letter there ever was. And Thomas Jefferson writes all of the grievances, all of the complaints that the colonists have from the king. And then they send it off to England and basically say, it's over, we're breaking up with you. Of course, the war is still going on. At this point, the colonists are very broke, they're hungry, they're tired, they're cold, and they need more supplies. And so they turn to the French. And they send people like Ben Franklin to France as ambassadors to say, please help us. And France says, we'd love to help, but we need to see that you can actually win this thing. Because up until now, the colonists have been losing and losing and losing. So the colonists do actually win a huge battle right after that, and that's the Battle of Saratoga. And so Saratoga is the turning point of the American Revolution because that's when French becomes an official ally of the United States. After that, we have to sit and wait for those French supplies to arrive. And so George Washington takes his troops. Guys, I got to admit, Miss Potter just walked in and I have no idea what I was saying. But I do know we're on Valley Forge. And so it's really, really cold and we're sitting around, we're waiting for French help. And George Washington is really afraid that he's about to lose his troops. But I don't want to talk too much about that on this page because I'm going to talk about it more on our next page. So let's keep moving. Okay, so finally the French help arrives and the colonists are able to trap the British redcoats on a peninsula in Virginia called Yorktown. The French Navy is out in the water. The colonists and the French are out behind the redcoats on land, and they trap them and they surrender. And then that's when they write the Treaty of Paris. And eventually, Great Britain finally has to admit that the United States is their own country, and they have to give over all the land that they've been keeping from them. Okay, so here's where I wanted to come back to Valley Forge because I wanted to spend one slide talking about at least one significant individual. So we'll talk about Thomas Paine on this slide. So Thomas Paine, we know, is an author. He's a patriot, and he wrote he wrote a lot, but he wrote 2 really important things for the Revolution. The first one we said was called Common Sense, and it's a small book or pamphlet that tells people exactly why they need to fight the king and revolt and declare independence. And because he's trying to convince people of his opinions, this is a source of propaganda. The other thing he wrote is called The American Crisis, but sometimes you'll see it called the Crisis Papers. And so when we say Valley Forge was really cold and really miserable and Washington had a hard time convincing his men to stay, this is important. Washington was not a great writer, remember, and so he goes into his barracks of men and reads The American Crisis to give them motivation and the will to continue on until the French support comes. Okay, I hope you feel better about your American Revolution stuff. Don't forget to come take your retest. Good luck.